I'm calling this sermon Family Reunion. But if I had more room in the bulletin for a longer title, I would call it The Scandalous Good News That There Is Always Room at the Table. We'll get to that later. First, I want us to look at this vignette about Jesus from 2 points of view. The same story, I want us to embody 2 different characters. In this story, we see Jesus at a house. It's kind of crowded. So crowded, it says that they don't even have enough room to put the food out. People are smashed into this place, hearing this Jesus, this teacher of the Judean religion, do his thing and talk about the movement of God. And then there's a knock at the door. It's his mother. Jesus, what do you think you're doing? People are saying, you're out of your mind. And they try to rein him back in. Now first, when we're like Jesus, that's a dangerous thing to say. I don't mean walking on water. I simply mean the Jesus we see in this story. When we're like the Jesus we see in the text that was just read, when we find ourselves, perhaps you can relate, in a place where someone, maybe a family member, is trying to turn you into someone that they want you to be. Maybe you were an art major in college, or maybe there was a family business and family footsteps that you found yourself deviating from. Sometimes we find ourselves with certain expectations placed on us. And in the story we read tonight, that's exactly where Jesus finds himself. A knock at the door, his mother saying, "What have you done with your life?" He has gone out of his mind. Now, I have a couple friends who have experienced similar encounters. And these are actually a couple friends. This is not the "I have a friend who" stories. This is actually friends. Although I'm sure I have plenty of my own, but I'll leave that for therapy. One friend, she grew up in a very religious house, a fundamental Christian house, and she grew up seeing that the highest calling was to work for God. But she was a woman, so she couldn't be a pastor. But of course, she could be a missionary. So she was going to be a missionary. And then her parents were so excited for her, and they would send her on mission trips when she was in high school, and she would go to other places and do these various ways of telling about God to all sorts of people. And then years later in her life, she continued to explore her faith, and actually she's a pastor today, but she's a pastor in a way that's slightly a departure from the faith of her origin. Rather than going on mission trips from a colonistic point of view to bring a God who's not there because God's already there, she brings a point of view that says God is with all of us and God is love. And the hardest part is times when she receives emails from her parents who occasionally eavesdrop on her life through this lovely invention called Facebook and see the ways that she is not quite following in the footsteps of her childhood. For example, one time she got a tattoo, and when she showed it to her parents on FaceTime, they were like, "Well, be sure to put a Band-Aid on that when you come visit us. We don't ever want to see that." Ouch. Reminds me of Jesus' mother knocking at the door saying, "You've gone out of your mind." At times we find ourselves with other people who are trying to tell us who they want us to be. But perhaps we can follow the example of Jesus in this story, who continues to be who he knows that he was called to be. Or as the great contemporary prophet India Ari says, just do you. There will be so many pressures from people in this world, potentially people in your family, just like Jesus encountered, people who are trying to impose upon you their version of you. But Jesus reminds us that you are called to do the work that you are called to do. What is it that God is calling you to do? Not your mother knocking at the door, not any footsteps that society is saying you should have been on this track, but instead you were an art major. Just do you. Now, the other perspective of this story, that was the perspective of when we find ourselves like Jesus. The other perspective is when we find ourselves like Jesus' family. When we find ourselves to be the ones knocking at the door. Now, by this I mean that we want a Jesus that we can control. We want a Jesus who goes to all of the marches I go to and supports all the causes I support and votes for all the candidates I vote for. If you want to be a real church theology geek, there's a name, Albert Schweitzer. Let me hear you say Schweitzer. There we go, that's a fun one. He was a Christian theologian who launched what is known as the quest for the historical Jesus. Because you see, Albert Schweitzer, such a fun word, he looked around at his contemporaries and realized that they were all describing a Jesus that simply reflected their own theological points of view, not a historical Jesus. So Albert Schweitzer said, I'm going to find the historical Jesus, the one that actually existed, not the one that these gospel writers wrote about, the one that actually lived and breathed and walked on the earth. Now, the ironic thing is that Albert Schweitzer, a man who admired social justice and prophetic movements, discovered his historical Jesus to be a prophet and social justice activist. His quest for the historical Jesus turned out to just be another mirror where Jesus looked a lot like him. It's very easy for us to simply perpetuate a God in our own image, a God that we want to have under our control. Author Anne Lamott once said that you know you've made God in your own image when God hates all the same people that you do. You see, this is why I think that we need various points of view, because there is no one point of view when it comes to God. We need all of our points of view. Albert Schweitzer tried to find the single historical Jesus and simply ended up holding another mirror to get a glimpse of himself. I think that being a person of faith, when we are seeking to understand this idea, this energy, this spirit we call God, I think that we need to approach it more like an art museum, where we don't just see one example of art, but we see a diversity of art on display, showcasing the ways in which people have existed throughout history. I can't just write down my view of God. I need to see and hear and encounter all of yours. The God I can control is not the God I'm interested in. That's what Jesus' family was trying to do, knocking on the door, trying to put Jesus back in a box. But I think that when we come together, we can unleash all of those boxes and discover a God who doesn't just look like me, but looks a lot like all of us. Just do you, and just let God do God. Now, this story involves a family. But Jesus turns it to a way that his immediate family did not quite expect. The story has it that Jesus is in this house, surrounded by people. His family comes to the door and says, "What are you doing in there?" They say, "Jesus, your mom's at the door." And he says, "Who's my mom? Who's my mother? Who's my brother? Who's my sisters?" All of us. It's like Jesus is saying, the family reunion has already started. They're just showing up late. Now, family reunions are interesting things. I have been to 2 of them in my life, both for my father's side of the family. One, I was about 8 years old, and the second time we gathered the family, I was about 28 years old. And in that course of time, well, first, when I'm an 8-year-old, I come to this family reunion, and I'm like, who are all these people? Oh, sometimes you go to a family reunion and you see people you didn't even know were invited. Then 20 years later, I get to this family reunion, and I'm like, wait a minute. You look kind of like that person I saw 20 years ago, but a little bit older. Sometimes you get to a family reunion, and people have changed in ways that you didn't quite expect. And when Jesus redefines this understanding of family, I think we had better prepare for the same thing. Jesus says that his family is not just his mother, his brothers, his sisters at a biological level. Jesus says his family is anyone who is called by God, who is a part of the movement of God, who is filled with the Spirit, the breath of God. This means that this family is a lot bigger than you would think. And when you find yourself at the family reunion, you might find yourself sitting across from some people that you didn't know or didn't expect to see here. But the good news is, it's a family reunion where all are welcome. This is the scandalous good news that there is always room at the table. Last Sunday, Adrian preached a sermon about heaven and hell. Well, it was indirectly about hell, more about heaven, specifically asking the question, do you really believe that everyone goes to heaven? Well, I kind of like to think that God's love is bigger than any sort of control I could put on it. Do I really think that God would invite people to the table even if they vote for the other candidate or have opinions that are the opposite of mine? Well, I certainly hope so, because once God starts voting for all of my issues and hating all the same people I do, I've made God in my own image. And so at this table, at this family reunion, Jesus reminds us that there are more people welcomed than we had anticipated. The church I served at previous to this one in West Michigan was one of those big-ish churches with lots of people, so you don't ever really know everyone, but there's a few people you get to know over time. One was the head of the elder chair. Her name was Betsy, and her husband, Rick. Now, Betsy and Rick were well known in the area. Betsy's husband, Rick, had unsuccessfully run for governor of Michigan as the conservative Republican candidate, and the church was a fairly progressive church, so it was a bit of like, how does this all work? And it was well known to many people in my circles, and even to Rick and Betsy, that I voted for the other candidate, and that I shared dissimilar points of view on many things. I was attending a worship celebration with my friend Andy, and we had time that evening for communion. And that evening we were invited to share communion with the people we ended up standing in line with. It was a church with like 3,000 people at a gathering, so the lines got kind of long sometimes. And you're standing there, and you get to the table, and you're supposed to serve one another communion. And so Andy and I look at the people behind us and realize, oh, it's Rick and Betsy, whose opinions are completely different from ours on just about everything. And we hold this bread together, and we say, and we hold this cup together, and we say, and the words come. The bread of life, the cup of blessing, was shared by people with different worldviews invited to the same table. I had another friend who witnessed this happen. I wish he had taken a picture, but he is not as addicted to his cell phone as I am, because he noticed it and he told me what he saw, and he said that was, to me, the best picture I've seen of the table of God, where when we say all are welcome, even if they live on different sides of a political spectrum, of a philosophical spectrum, we really mean it. The good news, the scandalous news, is that there is always room at this table, and that means there's always room for you. When Jesus says, "Who are my mother and my brothers and my sisters?" He is creating space for you to find yourself in the family of God. This is why my favorite church will always feel like a bar. Not just because I love pub theology, I do, but simply because I want a church, just like a bar, where everyone knows your name. Where you know and are known, just as you are. You don't have to check your baggage at the door, but we're going to help carry it with you. At this table, in this family, all are welcome. Who are my mother? Who are my brothers? Who are my sisters? There's room for all in the household of God. This table is bigger than you'd think. Thanks be to God.